Welcome to Revolution 713. Thank you for joining us here at the People's Forum. Thanks for joining on Zoom and live stream. Welcome, Mr. Albert Woodfox. Welcome, Mr. Paul Redd.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Welcome, Professor Joy James. And welcome, Daryl Robertson. I'd like to start with a few words from an unpublished interview by George Jackson. He said, "I would be sitting in a special locked isolation cell, sometimes even with the lock welded shut, and there would be no one to talk to, just the sound of screaming voices. And because there's no human contact, you depend on books. No contact with people. Special lock welded on the door. Nobody around. I'm strictly by myself. Oh, the only friend I have was a book. Sometimes I'd find myself talking out loud to the author. I'd sort of wake myself up and I'd hear myself talking to this other person. I guess it was like some kind of wish fulfillment. When I'm asleep at night, I still find myself talking to those guys." Those guys, Jackson would list them: Marx, Mao, the Black Panthers, Kwame Nkrumah, Lumumba. His prison letters, Soledad brother, trace his journey from his first request from his father, dated June 9th, 1965, asking for some reading, some book materials, some books by Mao Zedong and W.E.B. Du Bois. He traces in those letters asking his father, September 6, 1965, for a portable typewriter and a carrying case. And of course, through this trajectory, through this journey with these works, ultimately to the radical revolutionary writings that he would write and that would emerge from his pen, calling for, in his own words, a true internationalism with other anti-colonial peoples. George Jackson became, in the words of Professor Joy James, who's the foremost thinker and militant thinker on prison writings, Jackson became a dragon philosopher and a revolutionary abolitionist, transforming himself and his prison comrades into the military wing of a vanguard party, the Black Panthers. Now, Mr. Albert Woodfox, who joins us tonight, and Mr. Paul Redd, who also joins us as well, both traveled on that journey. Mr. Woodfox and Mr. Redd were both incarcerated, each for over 4 decades, most of that time in solitary confinement. Albert Woodfox at Angola, the infamous prison plantation in Louisiana. Paul Redd at Pelican Bay State, at Folsom Prison, and when he was at Pelican, on the short corridor, the secured housing unit. In his brilliant book, Solitary, published by Grove Atlantic to great praise in 2019, finalist for the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize, Albert Woodfox writes, "I turned my cell into a university, a hall of debate, a law school. Reading," he tells us, "was his salvation." "Reading was my salvation," he writes on page 161. "We read anything we could find on slavery, communism, socialism, Marxism, anti-imperialism, the African independence movements, and independence movements from around the world. Leaning against my wall in the cell, sitting on the floor, on my bed, or at my table, I read." Inspired by these written works and those of George Jackson, Albert Woodfox would found the first official chapter of the Black Panther Party behind bars and live his life as a revolutionary in prison. And inspired by these works and these words and George Jackson, as well, Paul Redd and the founding members of the Short Corridor Collective organized and inspired the largest ever prison hunger strike, leading over 30,000 men and women incarcerated in California in 2013 to go on strike leading efforts to end the hostilities in California prisons and changing the way that solitary was imposed in California. And what's so remarkable about these prison writings, these prison readings, prison study, and the journeys that George Jackson and Albert Woodfox and Paul Redd made is the way in which the written word circulates and sparks, inspires, nourishes, and sustains new revolutionary cycles. Remarkably, as we were planning this panel, we received a letter from a man on death row right now who had been inspired by Albert Woodfox's book, Solitary. Sent a letter to my dear friend and colleague and longtime remarkable attorney, mentor of mine, George Kendall. George actually represented Albert Woodfox and helped him get out of Angola. And it was actually thanks to George, a great friend and a great lawyer, that we have Albert Woodfox with us tonight. Received this letter from death row, right, with a caption, right, of Albert Woodfox's words, right, and a letter to George Jackson, to George Kendall, asking him, and at the end of the letter he asks to get a message to Albert Woodfox, and he writes he was going to try and find a way to contact him, give him this message, and he says, myself and some other socially, politically conscious comrades have been having teach-in sessions with your book, Solitary, here on death row. It's deeply inspiring and motivating, and we wanted you to know this. Just know that there are brothers down here who stand in that righteous tradition, and we all still fighting on, guerrilla love and respect. And so this goes on and on in cycles. The power of prison writings and of reading is simply unparalleled. It came together for me on September 23rd when my friend and colleague, Daryl Robertson, an amazing writer. He's written for the Washington Post, for Salon, Vibe, USA Today. And we were walking out of 100 Center Street, and he was coming out of Rikers Island, and we were picking up his property, and the property ended up being these two huge 75-pound bags with books in them. And let me tell you, they were heavy. There wasn't anything else. There wasn't any other property. Darryl didn't have any other property. It was just these books. And it really kind of smacked me in the face. That we need to study. We need to discuss prison writings. And what was one of the amazing things was the way in which you were continued with your writing while you were at Rikers, writing with those stubby little pencils, but finding a way actually to meet your deadlines and get your work done to USA Today. It's totally remarkable. So that's what we're here to do tonight. Talk about prison writing, prison writers, about study in prison and the effects that it has. And we've discussed prison writings in this 1313 already. We had a session on Antonio Gramsci's prison notebooks, right? Although we didn't look at it from that perspective. Previously, we've discussed Angela Davis's letter from Marin County Jail and Gandhi's work on Satyagraha, etc. And there are some in the room, actually, who are working on a project, which is a literary magazine, That Which Remains. We have some undergraduates who are working on that here. And that is publishing the work. But the opportunity now is to really delve into it. And I couldn't be more humbled and honored to be accompanied for this discussion by Albert Woodfox and Paul Redd, Professor Joy James, and Daryl Robertson. Let me just say a few words. I've already introduced them in a way through the introduction, but still, let me just say a few words, then I'm going to ask them to give some remarks and reflections on these questions. Of course, Albert Woodfox, author of the book Solitary, member of the Angola Three. He was released in 2016 after having served over 4 decades, predominantly all in solitary, having been falsely accused of a killing. The book's gone on to be the finalist for a number of prizes, and he's joining us this evening from New Orleans, so we're really thrilled that you could join us, Mr. Woodfox. Paul Redd is joining us from Oakland, California. He is a longtime legal activist, both inside and outside, well known as one of the top jailhouse lawyers in California. His legal activism extends all the way back to 1977, Wright versus Enomoto, which was a class action lawsuit that combated the California Department of Corrections' living conditions and repressive policies. Actually, in retaliation for that, he was sent to Folsom State Prison. In the last decade, he was a member of the Short Corridor Collective, a remarkable, and we've put, all of this is on the website, so there's information about this, there's readings, there are pieces by Daryl and Albert and everyone. There's also a spot where you can learn all about the Short Corridor Collective, which was a remarkable collection of persons on that, in the SHU at Palenga Bay, who then were able to participate in and help foster this several prison hunger strikes. And also, Paul Redd was one of the 16 representatives to sign the end of hostilities agreements. And of course, he remains committed to getting those released he left behind in prison, currently working to train law students and other attorneys on how to best assist those who are still behind bars. We also have with us Professor Joy James, who's the Ebenezer Fitch Professor of the Humanities at Williams College and the foremost authority on revolutionary and abolitionist prison writings, and what she and others, and a term I think from John Edgar Wideman, if I understand correctly, of the neo-slave narratives, which tries to cover a category that we might talk about this evening. Professor James is the author of Shadowboxing, Representations of Black Feminist Politics, of Transcending the Talented 10th Black Leaders and American Intellectuals, and Resisting State Violence, a really important book, which I think many of you have read, Radicalism, Gender, and Race in the U.S. There's many edited books, and of course, one is on our reading list tonight, The New Abolitionists, Neo-Slave Narratives in Contemporary Prison Writings. And she joins us this evening from Williams College. And in the room, we have with us Daryl Robertson, who is a Harlem-based writer, a friend. He was a Justice and Education Fellow at Columbia University, and his research includes hip-hop and black resistance. He's especially interested in understanding how the Black Panther Party served black communities during the late 1960s. There's one of his pieces is on Jonathan Jackson's death, actually, from Ozzy, I think. It's on the website, so you can read that, and actually, what nice coincidence, he was interviewing Professor James for that piece. He's also got a lot of other published articles, Salon Magazine, USA Today, Washington Post, and Vibe, and more. So, let me, so it's a remarkable and humbling panel to have with us to discuss what I think is one of the most important topics of our time. I thought we could start with Albert Woodfox and your thoughts. There's a piece on the blog that Albert Woodfox wrote and contributed for us, which I hope you've all read. But let me turn it now to you, Albert, if you would like to make some opening thoughts.
Well, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be on such a distinguished panel. When I joined the Black Panther Party, my first intimate contact with the party was in New York. I had escaped. I had been sentenced. I was 22 years old. I had been sentenced to a 50-year prison term for armed robbery. Naturally, at that time, I couldn't even fathom doing that 50 years. And so I said, immediately, do what all slaves do. You start plotting your escape. And eventually I was successful. And there were some stops along the way, but eventually I wound up in Harlem because I was familiar with Harlem from the days when I was a petty criminal. And but it was a different Harlem at the time. And, the Panthers was actively working in Harlem and working amongst the people, working for the people. And, at that time, I didn't have a strong sense of self-worth. I was in my very emphasis stage of, rebelling. And eventually I was arrested on a trumped up charge, which, I was found not guilty at trial and extradited back to New Orleans, Louisiana, where I was, born and raised. But while I was in Harlem, in the Tombs, or the Manhattan House of Detention, also known as the Tomb, I had a more close and intimate association with Patty. Some of the party members from the Panther 21 at that time were housed on the tier with me. And a young brother named Alfred Kane, who was no longer with us, was, I guess you can use the term, in leadership position at the time. And they immediately, usually when you're in prison, you see guys come in, especially African Americans, and, they become victims or they become predators. It's a law of survival, they say either you the wolf or you the sheep, And this is the first time that I had seen Black men come into a prison and not try to exploit other Black men, but reach out to them to form some kind of a bond, And at the time, I was listening to what they were saying, but I really wasn't hearing it. Until I read a book, a brother came now from upstate New York on a writ, habeas corpus, to try to get out after 25 years. And he had a fictional based on an actual occurrence in America. It was called A Different Drummer. And it was about the great migration of African Americans from the South to the West, the North, the East, believing that the promised land existed, only to be crushed and disappointed to find out that the only thing that had changed for the African Americans was location, And so I read this book. It was the first book I think I had read from the front to the back. It took me I don't know, hours to read it. But the next day when I went out, we left out the cell and we went into what's called a day room. And the Panthers used to hold political discussions and stuff. History, it consisted of everything. History, present situation, economics. This is the first time I had ever heard these terms mentioned in terms of African American people. But this time I wasn't just listening. This book had impacted me without me knowing. And I was understanding, I was able to draw points, understand some of the points were being made. And so, eventually I was extradited back to New Orleans. They had a shootout in New Orleans with the New Orleans Panthers. And because I had become their term a ringleader in the uprisings in the prison system, I was placed on a tier with 12 members of the Black Panther Party. And it was there that, I really became immersed in philosophy and the belief of the party. And I never in my wildest dream that I, thought that I would become a member of the party. People in prison were the forgotten ones. And so I worked along with the brothers on the tier, eventually the brother that was in leadership position sat down and talked to me one day about my potential and stuff. And it felt so strange, someone talking to me about leadership abilities and potential and stuff. Yeah, you gotta remember, I'm going through this internal struggle of petty criminal to social activist and revolutionary. And so he asked me how would I like to, join the party, and a lot of people think I actually joined the party in New York, but no, it happened in New Orleans in a prison cell. And, we had a demonstration over the horrible conditions, security guards who worked the tier, he was put on a house arrest, and we demanded to meet with the press and stuff to talk about what was going on, Orleans Parish Prison, which they called OPP at the time. And we were successful in getting some things changed. But as a result, I was shipped to the Angola. And I remember sitting down with Scott talking, and I'm like, what do I do now? Because I was still very, very confused about everything. But there was something in me, something I realized in later years that had been instilled in me by my mom. And he just said to me, he said, brother, you're a Panther now. You expect to fight for the people, to defend the people, to fight against, inhumane conditions when you get to Angola. At that time, Angola had been designated the bloodiest prison in America. Almost every day someone was being stabbed or killed or by either other prisoners, by security people. They had a brutal system called inmate guards, in which inmates were given weapons to guard other inmates. And the only requirement was you had to have a life sentence, because that way the turnover wouldn't be great, And so a guy could come into prison today with a life sentence, and within 30 days, he could be standing on a guard line or a guard tower with a weapon. That was the only training, and believe me, these men became even more brutal than the security people there. At that time, they used to call them free man, But I sat down with Scott and I said, well, what do I do? And he gave me my instructions, be a Panther wherever you go, uphold the principles and the values of the party. And so when I went to Angola, that's what I did. But of course, it was difficult because I had established a reputation in the crime life. So a lot of guys thought I was, as they say, I was kicking game. It was a way to get over. But as time went on and my dedication stuff, and more, people like, man, what done happened to you? And I would try to explain and as best possible that I found something. I always use the term that when I was growing up, the voice of the street was louder than my mom's voice, and believe me, she fought valiantly to try and save me, from what was at that time almost a rite of passage for black males to go to prison, and eventually the voice of the party became louder than the voice of the street. And I was, finally able to make that transition from petty criminal to social activist revolutionary. And unfortunately, most of it occurred in a 6x9 cell in 1972. Myself and Harmon and two other guys were framed for the murder of a prison guard. Who had been stabbed to death. And I went in solitary April 18, 1972. and I didn't walk out of solitary till my birthday, February 19th, 2016, after 44 years and 10 months of solitary, but in the process of that, there was certain required reading of party members. And, I remember reading in Soledad Brothers, and George made such a powerful impact because he taught me that, my mom used to always tell me that change is 100% desire and 10% doing. And I never understood that until I read George. I read George writing, and I was so impressed by what he had to say. And, he helped me tremendously to make that transition, from petty criminal to social activist, revolutionary. And so, I spent the next 44 years and stuff, living by things I learned from him. He actually taught me how to survive solitary. And one of the reasons was, he taught me about discipline. He taught me about dedication. He taught me about loyalty, things, but it's crazy. Like when I was going through this period, I kept saying to myself, this voice in my head kept saying, I done heard this before. I done read this before, and eventually I reached a point in my life where I'm like, my mom used to tell me this, or my mom used to try to tell me this. And, I could have kicked myself for, not truly seeing her, and as I've said before, imagine, my imagination when I realized that my mom was the first Harriet Tubman that I knew personally. She had the spirit and the dedication, the loyalty to although it was to our family. She set such a wonderful example that I was able to draw on in hindsight. And as far as eventually I read George's Blood in My Eyes, and I was so impressed because there's a map he had laid out for social struggle in this country, and somewhere along the line, the desire to write a book, formulated in my mind. And but the thing about it is I didn't want to start writing the book while I was in prison, because for some abstract way, it was like I was giving up. I was accepting that I would never go free. So I put off writing the book. I took a lot of notes and impressions of individuals and day-to-day things that went on, the brutality of solitary, and eventually, I was released, and I decided to write the book. And when I first started, I started out by myself, and I realized that I couldn't write the book by myself because I had so much pain in my life, and I've been the victim of so much brutality and stuff. I couldn't focus without, going through this internal struggle, this internal pain. And so Les, who's now, my fiance, at the time, she came into my life as a journalist, reading about our case and stuff. And, her impact is felt throughout the book because it was my life, it was my story, my experiences. But she was the one that helped me, kept me focused, made it possible for me to get through some of the most painful periods of my life. And, it's funny, even now, I don't know if it's a humbleness that I learned from other great men in my reading, but when I wrote this book, it was more not to be set an example or to read to inspire other people, but I just felt that though someone had to know what were the horrors of solitary confinement, what was going on. And at that time, the bureaucrats were famous for saying in the people's name. And, I'm like, the people can't know what's going on here. They can't know about the beatings and the brutality, the gassing, the suicides, the fighting for humanity, the fight for dignity, and so eventually I was released, as I said, on my birthday in 2019, February 19, 2016, rather. And so, eventually I wrote the book along with Les's tremendous help. And even now I'm still amazed at the reaction to the book. I'm both honored and humble. And when I'm asked to become a part of such as this panel and to be in the presence of other great men and women, it is a humbling experience, but one I truly enjoy, and I'm honored to be here.
Thank you so much, Albert Woodfox, for this, but also for your extraordinary book and for bearing witness in that book, to share it with us, right, so that we can bear witness. The way you incorporate George Jackson's work in the book is also fascinating. So you talk about him. You also use him at many kind of junctures as epigraphs for the 1970s and epigraphs for the 1980s, and we're going to come back to that. I like what you were just saying. You were talking about he taught me, and I want to come back to that idea. He taught me because, in a way, I think you taught yourself something. Maybe, and I want to try to explore later what it is about how it is that you teach that kind of that back and forth really with text. Paul Redd, I'd like you to intervene next if you wouldn't mind. You also have written. We've got a piece of yours that we put on the blog where you talk about George Jackson, also particularly the way in which important quotes of his. But why don't you give us some opening remarks first? Thanks for joining us.
After hearing what this brother just spoke about, it kind of made me reflect. Growing up in Oakland, so my family members was Black Panthers. So I grew up in West Oakland. I remember I used to sell the Black Panthers papers. Some of my relatives was related to some of the leaders of the Black Panthers back then. And I lived around the corner from where Bobby Hutton got killed. I remember the very next day, me and my little high school friends, we went and jumped over the fence and went up in that house where all that tear gas was, But when he spoke about his mother, I remember when I was about, I think, 7 years old, my mother came home from work and gave me a book called Man Child in the Promised Land by Claude Brown. I had no idea. I used to love to read books when I was a kid, but I had no idea why she gave me that particular book. When I read it, really didn't understand it, but I ended up reading that book over 100 times later on while in prison. And it finally dawned on me why she gave me that book. My mother was from Louisiana, and my mother used to have all these premonitions about her kids. And she used to have these visions, and she used to conceive police coming into the house, and she'd give us warnings, police gonna be coming here looking for somebody and all that kind of stuff. We like, oh, Mama, go ahead with all that, Yeah. As you get a little older and you start to get a little more wiser, and my wiseness came about when I got in prison. I never knew what racism was until I got to prison. Because like I said, I lived in West Oakland. I went to so-called tough love elementary and junior high school, which we had white teachers there. And I never associated that with racism, none of it until I came to prison. I actually seen it, through the administration, through the correctional officers, etc. And when I came to prison, I met a lot of brothers who was reading George, reading Mao Zedong, reading Linus and different things. And these brothers used to say, brother, what you need to start doing, you need to start reading more about your history, your culture, start learning more about where your place will be in history, And as I started reading a lot of that stuff, I guess that's where my fight started coming about, because I used to see how a lot of brothers used to get mistreated, getting denied their rights. So I decided to start picking up some of them little law books. And as I was reading them law books, I tried to find ways to help these guys file 602 appeals, to right certain grievances. And, that's where my commitment came about. And then I started getting involved with some of the major lawsuit cases as a class member. And I used to piss off the administration for being involved in that kind of stuff. And that gave me joy, because if I made them mad, that meant I was doing something right. So I kept on pursuing that issue. And as a result, they retaliated against me, put them labels on me to keep me in the hole. They put these gang labels on people to justify keep you in the hole. They're transferred to different prisons to keep you locked up in the hole. But like I say, I welcome all that. And eventually, I was put in the hole in 1977. And it was funny because when I was put in the hole, like I said, I was the beginning of the right versus motive. At that time, they didn't have what they call 114Ds, lockup orders to tell you what you've been in the hole for. So when I was been in the hole, I went to a committee. They locked up 8 other people with me. And when they locked me up, they said, Mr. Red, you're involved in the conspiracy to assault and kill staff. You and 8 other people. The next week, the other 8 was released from the SHU, except me, So they said, we're going to send you out to this yard and we're going to observe you for 90 days. We bring you back to committee. Now, this yard, prison officials used to label this yard. So they would label the yard BGF, NFs, and stuff like that. On the yard you can go to. They would label this. So you go out on the yard, you play handball, lift weights, basketball, you go back to committee 90 days later, oh, we seen you was observed talking to so-and-so, so-and-so, therefore you must be associate or a member of this organization. Therefore, we're going to keep you indeterminate in the SHU. I said, wow. Well, it took almost, 15 years later, or close to 20 years later, for another administration in Corcoran to find out all these years I have been an indeterminate was in violation of my due process, because nobody never provided me with 1030 forms telling me what I was in the hole for, So again, I started learning how the system really didn't care about us. They was retaliating against us because of the way we was thinking, the way we chose to stand up against things. I remember doing the parole boards. Certain guards would go in your cell and write down all the books that you read, and then go to the parole board and show the parole board the list of books that you was reading. And the parole board, would call you a militant and use that to deny you parole. If you was too big from lifting iron, you was a threat to the administration. Therefore, they would use that to deny you know. So over the years, you know, I got a good taste of how the system was trying to play us against each other. And finally, after years of being in solitary confinement, some of us decided we need to challenge this. So we did certain protests, but it really didn't stand up too solid because we were scattered around the shoes, you know? So it was hard to communicate and organize. But then, you know, politicians decided they wanted to spend all this new money on the Supermax prison, and they created Pelican Bay, which was supposed to be a top secret. And Pelican Bay was designed to keep the so-called hardcore prisoners who had a lot of influence locked down 24/7. You know, when you're in a cell, you're only going to the yard by yourself. If you got a cellie, you guys go to the yard by yourself. You know, and they broke it down to little pods, 8-man pods. So as that was going about, we tried to put some hunger strikes together, but they weren't really successful. Then prison officials decided in the early 2000, they decided they wanted to put us all in. First, they wanted to take our TVs. So one of the guards came by my cell and said, "Hey, Red, you know, Sacramento's talking about taking all you guys' TV." I said, "Well, you can unplug mine right now then." He said, "Why you want us to take your TV?" "Well, if I ain't got no idiot box to look at, then I can focus more on you guys." You know what I'm saying? So, you know, the CPOA took that back to Sacramento and said, "Hey, leave these guys' TVs alone." You know? So then they came and said, "Well, you know, they finna move you guys to the short quarter." I said, "Okay." I was in C facility at that time. So they said, you know, "You one of the first ones finna go to the short quarter." I said, "Well, let me pack my property." "Oh, we'll pack it up. We'll move it all around there where you're going, you know?" So I ended up going to the short quarter, and a lot of other people started coming to the short quarter. And in D1, the four main reps started talking about this hunger strike from Bobby Sands in Ireland. And from that was starting to grow where we're going to do a hunger strike. And the word started spreading around in that short quarter. And we actually did that first hunger strike in July of 2011, which was 6,600 prisoners that joined us. Then we did the second one, was 2012, which 12,000 prisoners joined us. And then we did the third one, 2014, which 30,000 California prisoners, and people around the country joined us. Prison officials got mad. They start, us main reps, they start putting us in isolation before the hunger strike even started. You know, they'd move us over there with no property, nothing. And then they put these big old water holes all in front of our door, you know, like we can slide food. What food? You guys didn't bring no food with us. So we had no food to slide. So when that was going on, prison officials then was getting embarrassed. So what they did was, and it was funny because they started putting the bogus rumor out that our attorneys and them was passing this information about the hunger strike, which was ludicrous. So wait a minute. The attorneys didn't have to pass nothing. These bright, intelligent prison officials put us all in one quarter together where we can talk through the toilets, we can talk over the walls, we can talk through the door, we can slide little kites through the crack of the wall. It had nothing to do with an attorney. You know what I'm saying? So they was upset at that. till they finally realized they made the mistake by overthinking how they can put us all together. They should have kept us like we was before, all scattered around their entire shoe when them hunger strikes was unsuccessful, But again, we all knew, being in that short quarter, the only way to be successful at bringing down the administration was through unity. So we did that in the hostility, where 16 of us signed that. And we was able to get the word out to youth facilities, county jails, other prisoners, letting people know, hey man, let's come together. Stop allowing IGI, prison administration, guards, and them to play us against each other. When doors open, don't respond. You shake your neighbor hand if they open it with another race, and go on back in your cell. So once we started doing that, then a lot of, the guards, the racist guards who was trying everything they could to break this strike, and they see it wasn't working. And we was able to get a lot of more support from people, because what we did, we had the 5 core demands, but we also, in our writings, we was putting things together for general population. So we identified some of the problems that was going on in general population, and told prisoners, if you guys having these kind of problems, you guys need to join up and participate in the hunger strike and get you guys problems corrected as well. And people start realizing that. And that brought about that big old change where the yards started getting unified as well. Because, I wrote a poem. Actually, I wrote a poem called "What Do You See?" And I had put it in Pelican Bay Express back in, I think it was 91, might have been 91. And when I kind of echoed George Jackson's words, settle your quarrels, come together. You know what I'm saying? So when I put that in the writing, that was telling people, George said this years ago. We can win if we can come together. So we put that back and started talking about that during in the hostility. Settle your quarrels, come together. Stop allowing prison officials to play us against each other. And once we do this, then you got that unity. And you can't break unity, And we proved that when 30,000 prisoners joined us, because then the administration realized these guys are serious. They got people listening now, and so that unity changed the policy. I'm one of the plaintiffs in the Asher's lawsuit. And we just recently got another win, expansion of monitoring that case there. But even that the Asher case, we fought hard, trying to prove our case, and we did prove it. Prison administration, they played dirty. They fabricated things. They manufactured confidential information. The parole board would use confidential information to deny you. And they would come out with all the little tricks they could. But one thing always stood up: that power of unity. Unity breaks it all, and it solidified and brings it all together. And like I said, listen to Brother Al. And like I said, it brought back a lot of memories growing up, what he was saying, and even inside the prison system. I went to the parole board 14 times and got denied 14 times. And that the last time was in 2018. And one of the board members, at that time, I didn't know, our mediation team in the class action Asher case, she had went public and told the board commission went public, said anybody who participated in the hunger strike, I wasn't gonna find them suitable parole. Well, I didn't know that was her that was sitting in front of me at that time. So she ended up finding me unsuitable and say, you know what, you'll be back in a year. When you come back in a year, they're gonna find you suitable. What I didn't know was the next day she was retiring. Our mediation team put enough pressure in Sacramento with them senators, but they wouldn't confirm her for the next commission. So she retired the very next day. And then the very shortly after that, my attorney, who had been working on my case, him and his wife for years, flew down to see me. And when he saw me, he said, I'm gonna go to the San Francisco Public Defender's Office and see if I can get them to take you to a Franklin hearing, because you should have got found suitable at that last hearing. Well, when he went to see them, one of the ladies there, Danielle Harris, had told him they wasn't going to take my case on that Franklin hearing. So he came back kind of upset. I was upset too, because I knew the Franklin actually did benefit me. Well, she came to visit me 2 days after that. She said, I got good news, I got bad news. Which one you want first? I said, well, I'm used to the bad news, so give it to me. So she said, well, the bad news, we're not going to take you to the Franklin hearing, but we feel that you've been in prison far too long. Chester Bodine, the district attorney in San Francisco, we're going to file an 1170 motion and ask him to recall your sentence. And they put the paperwork in. Chester Bodine's office wrote the judge for a court hearing. And next thing I know, I went to a court hearing. The judge set the date. They vacated my first degree murder conviction, sentenced me to a manslaughter with no parole, and I was released in 5 working days. You know, so, and since I've been out, I've been committed to helping other formerly incarcerated to get out, and those who still behind to get out as well. And so I've been talking to attorneys and law students and working with different people to get a whole new movement going on that to get people out. Because one thing we know is that this system treats us unfairly all around the table. And we already have all the stats and evidence to expose that, but we need to exercise that unity again and unite those to put together those voting powers and vote people out of office that's not going to do what we asking them to do when it's just, you know. So it's a pleasure to be here, to talk to you, to talk to all you guys, to meet you people, and hopefully, you know, some more from this here can carry on, you know.
Thank you so much, Paul Redd. Thank you so much. I wish you were in the room with us right now, because there's a lot of mm-hms going on here. So you'd be well surrounded. That was really powerful. I was particularly interested by the way in which you spoke about the kind of the mistake that the Department of Corrections made in bringing everyone together on the short corridor. I wonder, maybe it's a mistake. On the other hand, maybe it's that there is always this resistance, right? Always this resistance, always new ways,
you know,
right?
I say mistake. It was a blessing to us. You know what I'm saying? Because a lot of us was younger when we first came in the system. And being in there for decades, we got older, a lot more wiser. We read a lot more books. We learned more about our culture, to appreciate and love other races. So now we in a short quarter. Now those who used to be kind of bitter at other races now have a lot more respect for each other, because we realize that blood is the same color red. You know what I'm saying? So once we realized that we was able to educate ourselves, and people started saying, hey man, only way we gonna win, we got to come together, you know, and it worked.
Right.
And it could still work today.
Right.
I remember when I got out, I was Dorsey Nunn, as all of us Nunn, asked me to participate in this phone banking on Proposition 17 to restore the voting rights for formerly felons. So we got involved in that, and it passed. So felons, people who had former felons, was able to now vote, and that was 50,000 former felons. That's 50,000 votes. So I'm saying now we need to bring those together and talk, see what ideas they have to help change that system within, and come together and start at the bottom. Because we start at the bottom, we can kick them out of the top, you know, and it's just doing that. They said, well, Mr. Rage, you know, people gonna be mad at you because you're out. I said, well, they was mad at me when I was in. You know, now I know where they buried all their little bodies at, so they're gonna really be mad now. But what else can they do to me? You know, they shot at me inside the prison and done everything, and I survived it. You know, and I'm gonna survive this and hopefully get some more changes going.
Indeed, you survived, and it's so moving to have you with us here. And later on, you too are an author, and we were talking last week, and you were reading some of your poetry for us, and so I hope that maybe that's where we're going to close later on. I asked you to have your book of poetry close by, so maybe that we're at the end of the seminar we'll close. Now, these questions of resistance, that's something that Professor Joy James has been writing about so powerfully, different ways in which there are different forms of resistance, from more revolutionary to more into the abolitionist and the relationship between the two. So it's a real honor and pleasure to have you with us, Professor James. And let me ask you to make some opening remarks as well.
Sure. First, I want to thank Albert Woodfox and Paul Red. It's just, you're like the living word. And I'm so grateful for the decades of contributions that you've made. And when you were speaking, I was thinking, of course, about George Jackson, because it's sort of the nexus here, which brings us all together. And I've always thought of him as enslaved, but a rebel, a theorist, a strategist, and someone wrapped in agape, revolutionary love shaped by political will. And, as both of you spoke, I kept seeing all those aspects of your dynamic personalities, but also, how this suffering became transformative for you. I mean, you were able to give from a zone of suffering and also a predatory zone. And so it's an incredible living model, that we all need to study and then see what our relationships might be. So for me, briefly as an academic, right, that's like my day job. But I was introduced to George Jackson largely through Panthers or people who had organized right in California. So I remember when Dhoruba bin Wahad got out, because you mentioned being in New York City, right in the Harlem Panthers, and he came to speak at UMass Amherst, and that was my first job, was in women's studies, and it seemed like odd for women's studies to understand why we were going to help sponsor this, but the way he shared what it was like in the 19 years, the way he shared, again, strategy, analysis, and history. It's like there's no way that we understand or that I can understand to teach or write without the history being made clear, and also it being living history, not just sort of content or data that you extract and that you write up. And then later I went to California and I had a postdoc. So I was at History of Consciousness. I chose to take it to work with Professor Davis for a while. And while in California, I was in someone's home and I saw a 6-foot poster of George Jackson, on the wall. I had no idea who it was, but it's that poster where he's shackled, right? And he's on his way to court or coming out of court. But you can see in his countenance, in his face, he's never defeated. I think he wrote something that he would not be a broken Black man or something to that effect, right? And so I asked, who is this? Because it's an introduction, by a visual, but also, again, it's an imprint that stays in your mind. I think as a culture, as a people who've been preyed upon for centuries, and I heard that when you were talking about your mothers and your families, about your comrades, about people who you loved and people who loved you, we read reality through all these different levels, right? From the spirit, from the material, from the desire. And so it's just the imprint that led me to ask, who is this? And then to be told. And then this becomes the cover of an anthology, which actually is my favorite of all I think I've done 4 or 5, anthologies on incarceration, but imprisoned intellectuals. So that photo of George is on the cover of the book. And his spirit, his tenacity, his love, his rebellion, his strategies, his theory, his fearlessness, and also his militaristic presentation, right, is part of the learning cycle. And, to go back to what Bernard was saying, I think it's difficult in the academy that's where I'm based, right? That's, quote, my industry. It's difficult to have that much courage, even if it's just about the text, I don't even have the words for it. You have the words for it, right? So I'm going to try. To sit in a classroom and to be able to read and not be a consumer, but to decide to be an ally, right? An ally to work against the 13th Amendment, against the prison industry as a form of captivity, enslavement, against anti-Blackness, against capitalism, against imperialism. And George's writings, your writings, bring us very close to that reality that we have to grapple with without having to be in a zone of complete terror and predatory structure that we pay for with our tax dollars, right? So there's a few things I want to say about I was really struck about what you said, Robert, when you were quoting George, that we all have to come together. But I also see these obstacles. Some of them are shaped by class. Some of them are shaped by leadership that's more performative than tied to what you've been describing. And some of it's shaped by the academy itself, because academia, as much as we want to be allies, it's also structured for something else. It's structured for accumulation of stories and narratives, right? And so I appreciate this panel here because it's showing different ways of not how to be someone who accumulates, but also someone who can be humbled by the larger stories and the larger commitments. So the things that I want to close with, because I want to keep it really short, is to talk about some of the community intellectuals that I've met recently. So one is Kamasi, who was speaking with Kalonji on Black Power Radio, and Kamasi did time with George Jackson. And so this interview happened this week. And if you want to go to Black Power Radio BPM, you'll find this brilliant hour-long discussion about someone who worked with George and who had gone, as George had, from different prisons to different prisons because their organizing was seen as a threat. And also how people attempted to, quote, follow the rules, right? But to know that all the rules are in opposition to freedom and to dignity and honor. So at some point, the rules become, there's no logic to them other than the logic to break people, right? And to dismember Black agency and the agency of all people around human rights, around solidarity, and around freedom. So there are other people that I've learned from, and I'm thinking of Jericho. Bernard mentioned that I'd referenced John Edgar Wideman in terms of the neo-slave narratives as a concept. But actually, if I remember correctly, because the writings have happened over like the last 20 years or so in terms of the anthologies, that writing would have been from John Edgar Wideman, would have come from his introduction to Mumia Abu-Jamal's Live from Death Row, right? And so again, there's a connection with the leadership, the intellectualism of the captive, right? But there also has to be a willingness to engage in the politics that both of you are representing, like the legal strategy, the political strategy, and just the determination to stay true to a particular political ethic. So when I think of John Edgar Wideman's writings, right? And I learned from writing, but it's really like a unit like Jericho, which works with political prisoners, that meeting some people, writing to them when they're incarcerated, anthologizing them, interacting as best I can from, the zone that I'm in, which is not necessarily a terror zone, but it's a very corporate zone, right? It's that dynamic intellectualism which has introduced me to Leonard Peltier, who now has COVID, Sundiata Okoli, Veranza Bowers, Ed Poindexter, Reverend Joy Powell, the Virgin Island Five, and others, right? There's more people than I can name here. So there's a couple of things I want to say in closing. I'm really trying to figure out, so I'd be helpful for any assistance that you can offer. How can the academy be more relevant in the struggle? And how is it that we as academics can stand down in terms of overly influencing what leadership looks like when we don't occupy these zones of extreme vulnerability and predatory behavior from the state? The other thing that I'm trying to figure out in dialogue with others is this concept of slavery that is debated when we talk about abolitionism. So when I think of Max Parthas or Marshall Eddie Conway interviewing him for the Real News Network a couple years ago about the abolition of the 13th Amendment, right? So they're doing a state-by-state referendum because the 13th Amendment, if you've been duly, that's air quotes, convicted of a crime, involuntary servitude or the slavery that you've been both talking about, right, is an imprint, that tracks you and also attempts to break you. But we have no consensus on the outside what this slavery is, how to define it, and how to mobilize against it. So there are these debates, when Max speaks, when I hear him speak, he's looking for the abolition of the 13th Amendment. Other people are looking for the abolition of the prison industrial complex. There are these different phrases, and I agree we all need to come together, but I'm not sure we've built the bridges. The last thing I would say when I'm thinking of the strike at Rikers right now, even though people have said that it's stopped, but given the conditions of Rikers, I doubt that it has. It seems to me it's been easier for us to see the opposition and predatory formations if they come in the guise of white politicians or white prison guards. But as I've said on other platforms, and I've been told to wait and see how it pans out, but whatever. We have in New York City a Black mayor who used to be in NYPD, and we have a Black police commissioner who's a Black woman. So there are ways in which Black feminism gets shaped, like, if we just get a Black woman as vice president or Black woman at X, Y, and Z, somehow things are going to be proactively better in terms of dealing with predatory capitalism, with exploitation in the prisons. And I'm curious about how we could navigate that desire to see Black leadership within structures of power and to think that's a pathway towards freedom and equity. And if we could demystify that desire, like we had this big desire around Obama and others, right? What would solidarity look like? And what would it mean to take leadership, not just the stories, but leadership from those who've spent years, decades struggling, particularly in the most difficult arenas, meaning prisons, ICE camps, et cetera, as we consider what are the possibilities for freedom, particularly, this is my read of it, as neo-fascism went from the underground to the above ground. So again, my deep appreciation for your wisdom and for your gifts.
Thank you so much, Joy James. I'm really taken by this idea of yours of interrogating how to read with courage, as you were suggesting, and kind of to read and not just be consumers. And I'd like to think that that's the project that we're engaged in here as part of this public seminar. A lot of the issues that you spoke of at the end also, I think, intersect in a direct way with some of our previous conversations. Kianga Yamata Taylor actually had a brilliant piece in the New Yorker about many of those issues of, it was written about Kamala Harris, so we've got that on that, and also Kendall Thomas, who was with us last time, who's actually on a mission to and has a project to abolish the 13th Amendment, is doing a lot of this work and thinking through many of these issues as well. So I'm glad that you raised those issues that tie so well to some of the other seminars that we've had, and that is really a focus of our attention. In a way, when you say not just be consumers but an ally, then the question becomes how can we do even more than that somehow, right? Let me turn now to Daryl Robertson. You've written a brilliant piece for us, which really goes to the writing as well. George Jackson's writings, the way you talk, that George Jackson writes with the tautness that I've always felt inside of my body. So there's a real connection here. And I'd like you to talk about that a little bit.
All right, so can everyone hear me? So I was initially introduced to George Jackson actually through hip hop, particularly Nas. I'm a real hip hop head, so hip hop was my classroom. I left high school, dropped out, and I was educated through hip hop, through the hip hop magazines, Vibe, Double XL, Source, King magazine. So Nas wrote a song called Testify. This song came out like 2006, 2007. And he dedicated this song to Jonathan and George Jackson. And throughout the song, Nas went on to critique the United States government through his lyrics. And I was always curious. At this time also, I was very young. Like I said, I left school and I was selling drugs. I was a full-time drug dealer at the time. But the information that I picked up through the hip-hop magazines and through hip-hop sparked my curiosity. So when Nas would mention these thinkers, these revolutionaries, these writers and scholars through his music, like I would go buy books by these individuals or books written by these individuals. And some of the books that I wouldn't purchase because Nas mentioned them is Assata Shakur's autobiography, which Dr. Joy James wrote a really brilliant piece, Framing the Panther. If you haven't read it, I definitely encourage you to read it. I've bought Revolutionary Suicide because of Nas mentioned Huey P. Newton. I brought Seize the Time because Nas mentioned him. I brought W.B. Du Bois, Langston Hughes because of Nas said so. And of course I bought Soledad Brother because when I heard the name George and Jonathan Jackson through his music, I wanted to find out who these men were. But I actually didn't read Soledad Brothers until I went to prison, which is like 2 or 3 years after this particular song came out. I went to Parchment, which is actually a plantation identical to Angola. That's the penitentiary I went to also at a young age. Yes, in Mississippi. So reading George Jackson, one of the first things that really stuck out to me reading George Jackson in Parchment is when he admitted to having these feelings for most of his life that he would one day go to prison. That stuck out to me because I also had those feelings from as long as I could remember. I just always knew, I had this feeling that I would go to prison someday. Prison was always part of my life through my uncles, through all of my cousins, through all of like the guys in the neighborhood. And even me, I began going to juvenile jail at a very young age. The first time I ever went to jail, I was 10 years old. So prison, I was always directly impacted through prison. Me and my grandmother having to send money to my uncles in prison, going to see uncles in prison, and all of the big kids coming home from prison, the neighborhood. And back then, I never would have admitted to that. Like I always knew I would go to prison. So when I read, when reading Soledad Brothers, that he admitted that. Also, too, I should note that during this time, I was playing with the idea of becoming a writer. So when I read that, I was like, wow, like writing is a way for me to actually be honest about everything I've been through, about everything I've experienced, about the thoughts that I've had, the thoughts that I think are embarrassing. Like I can put this stuff out into the world through writing. So that was like the first thing from George Jackson that stood out to me. Another thing that stood out to me, well, when I think about George Jackson also, I'm reminded of this song from Jay-Z. It's called Can I Live? This is from Jay-Z's first album, Reasonable Doubt. And on the introduction to that song, Jay-Z says, we hustle out of a sense of hopelessness. And through that hopelessness, you see our desperation. We feel we have nothing to lose, so we offer you our lives. And that quote reminds me of George Jackson, because the discipline that it takes to be in a situation, whether it's Parchments, Soledad, Angola, to going through the situations in prison, to have the discipline to constantly think and study and write and want to connect to something that you feel is bigger than you, it takes a lot of strength to do that. And as we know, especially from reading The Blood of My Eye, through his desperation, George Jackson made a conscious decision to be part of something that was bigger than him. So when I take all that together, and I'm playing with the idea of becoming a writer, like, wow, so not only can I tell the truth through writing like George Jackson, but here this man is basically served a life sentence for $70, and he was able to still find a way to be a part of something that's bigger than him. That's exactly what inspired me to write. But one thing I also learned through George Jackson is I'm still chasing the truth as a writer. Like I'm still chasing the truth. So when we're out here looking for the truth, it's not something that you find. It's something that you have to constantly search for. And even as far as like freedom goes, when you're in those situations, you find these moments of relief through reading. You find these moments of release through resistance in prison. You find these moments of release through dialogue with your fellow inmates in prison. Those are moments of freedom that you find. But in the physical sense, even when you are released, at least in my case, you have this physical freedom from prison, but you also find too that you're still constricted by all these other factors that goes on. So between freedom, chasing the truth is something that is constantly ongoing, and you're constantly looking for new ways to explore the truth, to explore freedom, and to constantly find new ways to be part of things that are bigger than you. So keeping it brief, those are the main things that I learned from George Jackson.
Thank you, Daryl. Thank you so much, and for your brilliant piece. I think maybe this is the perfect setting, maybe to turn back to Albert Woodfox and Paul Redd, maybe with the problematic that Joy James raises about the possible, the relationship to the academy in a way, because that's really at the core of this Revolution 1313 series, right? Which is, do we return to the texts of essentially kind of academic critical thinkers, or do we turn to the texts of worldly revolutionary philosophers? I mean, and when you look at the influences that were important to George Jackson, that were important to Albert Woodfox, Paul Redd, they're listed, right? It's Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, Engels, Mao. That's George Jackson talking. I met them in prison. In prison, I met Mao, Marx, Engels, Zhou Enlai, Fidel, Che, George Jackson, Ho Chi Minh, Kwame Nkrumah, and especially Frantz Fanon. And so, I mean, in a way, that does raise a really important question as to what is the important question is not, what is the role of the academy, but the important question is how do people in the setting of academic seminar, research, writing, etc., which many of us are situated in, how does that contribute? How does that help? And there's a way in which, when I read Albert Woodfox, what you talk about, what you went through, and Paul Redd with the Short Corridor Collective, the way in which there were these reading clubs, right? The letter from Death Row, right? We're having a teach-in on your book. It is an academy in a way. There's a way in which it feels as if many of the important junctures that lead to praxis are forms of study that we're actually used to in the academy, but that are taking place in a it's the same thing taking place on the Short Corridor in isolation. So maybe back to you, Albert Woodfox. You've actually been talking a lot at law schools, for instance, and at a lot of, I was noticing, you've been giving a lot of interventions in what we would call classically the academy. So how do you feel about the relationship there, and in part picking up on the issues that Joy James was raising about how people in the academy can contribute? Albert, you want to jump in? Are we having problems with the Zoom? Or we got a small delay? Oh, we got to turn the mute button, turn the mute button off. There we go.
Okay.
There we
Can everyone hear?
Yes, thanks.
Oh. I still haven't got total control of technology yet, me, I've always read, a lot of my, we use the term raising the level of consciousness, to the point where it's something you've been accepting all your life is no longer acceptable, because your sense of self-worth, your humanity, your moral, whatever has been raised by, people who, right? Me, my book was written from experiences, my experiences. Intellectuals, they write, and this is just, my thing, they write from observation of other people's experiences. And they try to take that and put it in a format where they can pass those experiences on to other people. So that's always, like I say, the first book I read was a fictional piece of book based upon on real events, which is the different drummer. The great migration of African Americans from the South to other parts of the country, believing that, you know, the promised land existed, you know, that they would finally be free from the horrors of slavery in the South and stuff. And so that was my first awakening, you know. The first political book I read from front to back was Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon, you know. From a different drummer, I learned that an individual, even though it might be his intention, can make a difference by the way he carries himself, the things he believes in, the things he's dedicated to. And so, you know, I remember, I think it was the Art of War of either Mao or the Red Book or something. They talk about having this pretty bow and arrow, you know, and you admire it and you hold it and you look at it, but it doesn't serve its purpose until it's shot. Otherwise, you know, you can have great ideas and all that, but if you don't put them into practice, then they remain great ideas, and that's it. You know, so I think you have to have this merging of intellectualism and objective reality, you know, finding a way to use the intellectual observation and come up with a way to put it into practice to cause change. At least that's been my experience, you know. Some of the, it took me approximately 20-something years to become, make that transition. It wasn't an overnight thing. It wasn't just joining the party. It was years and years and years of struggle, years and years of defeats, every once in a while a minor victory that drove me, The strange thing about it, when we were put in solitary, in April 18th, 72, Harmon and I. And then a week or so later, Robert was brought to, Robert Hillary King was brought to Angola from New Orleans. Now, he was placed in solitary for an investigation for a crime that occurred when he wasn't even in the prison, But he represented that threat because we all represented the threat in the fact that we went from intellectual theory to objective practice. We took ideas and whatever that was inspired in us by the readings of intellectuals and tried to apply it to life. Of course, they wasn't too happy with that. The biggest thing, I think, with the prison, systems, various systems at Angola is they couldn't break us. Harmon did a beautiful poem in the book, Men of Steel, how we had to project images physically that we really didn't feel intellectually, we had to present ourselves as being, no matter, what you do to us, we gonna king. Robert has a saying: if someone throws lemons at you, make lemonade. And that's what we did. As I said in the book, our cells were meant to be death chambers. We made a conscious intellectual decision to make them high schools, universities, debate halls, law clinics. Our initial struggles in CCR, which is closed cell restriction, solitary, was all physical. But from that experience, we realized, and from readings of other men and women throughout history, we realized that our bodies just couldn't last, just physically struggling. So we had to figure out another way to supplement that physical struggle, and it became the law. Problem is, we didn't know nothing about the law. We didn't even understand the law. So we had to start applying that, and because of some other great inmate prisoners. You know, there's always unsung heroes in social struggle, you know. And these guys made it possible for us to get books out the library and stuff, law cases, stuff that could have got them locked up. And we started applying ourselves. We started studying. And anybody that knows anything about the law, it can be as frustrating because you read a case where a judge is saying this, and then you read another case where a judge, so you have to understand the language of the court, you know, and you got to try to find little nuggets in these decisions. And that's what we did, you know. And so we became very good at filing. It's called 1983 civil rights suit on conditions and stuff like that, you know. And so, and when you know, when the administration or the security staff would force the issue, we would be physical because we didn't have time, you know, to sit down and figure out how we're going to file this lawsuit or whatever, you know. So it was a combination of both. I think, you know, intellectuals play a very important role in social evolution, you know, because they inspire people, they inspire ideas, they raise level of conscience, you know. I remember we did a 45-day hunger strike to get them to feed us in a humane way, to cut all the cell blocks didn't have food slots. So we used to put our food on the floor and slide it under the door, you know, and we used to accept that. But at some point in time, our level of conscience was raised through reading. This is inhumane. This is beneath me. This is beneath me as a human being to be fed like this. And so we demanded food slots be cut. And we went on a hunger strike for 45 days. And out of our concern for some of the guys on the till who were, you know, passing out and stuff from not having food, we decided we had to find a way to compromise. And so our compromise was we would eat if we could hold our tray and eat through the bars. And that's what we did. We didn't know it was going to be 18 months, but we ate through the bars for 18 months. And, you know, and they say, you know, the necessity is the mother of invention. Eventually somebody come up with the idea of make a little shelf on the cell door with string cardboard. And so everybody started making shelves. So they would bring the food in and set it on the little shelf, but we still ate through the bars, you know. But that was just, you know, your experiences stimulate, you know, survival instincts. You find ways to survive, you know. But it starts with other men and women who write, you know, the intellectuals who write books, who have you know, have the luxury of observing. They have the time, you know, they can intellectualize, they can do studies and stuff, you know, whereas, you know, someone that's in that moment don't have that. It's more instinctive than intellectual. But if you don't have the intellectual to study these struggles and how they originated and what was the outcome, then you can't teach. You know what I mean? And so for me, that's the connection between, you know, intellectuals, some of the greatest intellectuals, you know, throughout history, you know, inspired me. You know, like I say, the first political book I ever read was a Retro of the Earth, and I realized, I began to understand what social revolution is and what that, you know, what factors inspire people to rise up. You know, that level of conscience by reading what it raises that level of conscience to what is once acceptable becomes unacceptable. But the key is what you're going to do about it. All right, now you know. So what you're going to do about it, you know. I remember we fought the strip searches, and to me, I never thought about it. But reading history books on child slavery And I realized they used to put my ancestors on slave blocks, and they did to them the same thing they were doing to us. Stripping us, making us spread our genitalia and making rude comments, racist comments and stuff, And I'm like, well, this had nothing to do with prison security, And Angola is a plantation, farmer plantation, and most of the people that work and run Angola, generation and generation are overseers, And so they pass down this thing, so they look at us as being subhuman. And so they still, the battle was, they want to treat us as modern day chattel slaves, as to us developing a level of consciousness, us developing a sense of self-worth, us developing how we going to be treated. We're not going to be treated the way you want to treat us. We're not going to see ourselves the way you see us. We're going to see ourselves the way we see ourselves, the intellect we have developed about what kind of human beings we're going to be. And there's always that contrast. I think there will be a need for struggle, whether it's intellectual, physical, natural. That is the thing. I consider myself to be a dialectic materialism. I believe that contradiction causes change. And once something that is useful at the moment becomes unuseful, then change must occur in order to move forward. And I think that is a battle that will always be fought amongst humanity.
Thank you. Boy, also, that was a really great way of introducing what is typically an academic concept, right? Dialectal materialism, putting it in such great terms for us to think about it and use it. And so clearly there's this fluidity of the theoretical and the practical that's going on here that's really amazing. And the idea of raising consciousness, I think, is which you started with, I think, is probably the most important thread through this relationship between the theory and practices. Paul Red, let me quickly, you in our conversation that related to this, right? You were talking about how actually pages were passed through the cracks and in order to create possibilities for conversation between folks and adjacent cells, et cetera. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about how that worked physically, actually, how the exchange happens, how it is that you create a teach-in or a seminar on the short corridor.
And before I touch on that, can I back up some ways?
Yeah.
To kind of like answer the question that was put out there. Like, all these prisons in different states are operated differently. The solitary confinements are operated differently. Here in California, if you go all the way back to the early years, the reality was a lot of them was operated by Democrats. And when the Democrats ran certain prisons, and here in California, they allowed certain things to go on. And once the politics started bickering with each other, politicians, then you got into the Republicans, where the Republicans started changing guards. Now, when they did that, you can go back to Ronald Reagan, Duke Major, Pete Wilson, all that. Now, inside the prisons, we was allowed to have drawings and pictures of George Jackson, Jonathan Jackson. You was allowed to do writings. You wasn't penalized. Your thinking wasn't criminalized. Over the years toward the 80s, then your thinking became criminalized. The prison administration and a lot of their cronies inside started taking offense the writings by George Jackson, the writings by various of people. And they started using that to penalize us. And to show you how stupid, again, I like using that word to show how stupid it was. The mail used to come through them and they'll pass it out to us. They'll let us have this writing, the newspapers, etc., with these articles. But then when it was time for them to start using that in a committee to extend our stay in solitary confinement, then they want to validate us with these drawings, these postcards, and all that. And I remember Brother Billy X sent me a collage one time that had, Black August on there, George, Jonathan. And I remember I had some drawings that did some portraits and of Jonathan with the carbine and everything. So when IGI came to my cell to do my 6-year review, they confiscated all that. And they said, we are using this to extend your stay in solitary confinement and validate you as a member. So I said, well, how can you validate me as a member when it's you guys who brought it to my mail at mail time? You let me have it. You wasn't going to use it at that time. So that's why you let me have it. So you lead me to believe it's safe for me to have this stuff in my cell. So it's time for you to use it against me.
Yeah.
Now, we know that if we was to sit back and put together, a committee of people to actually dig up when these changes start to occur, and we'll be able to show how we as Africans been disenfranchised with this process. People of color, is still going on right now today. And thanks to social media, now we have access to really putting people on blast with that. And I think it's time for us to come up with that formula to put all these documents back out there and show how the system used that racism to lock us for decades in these holes, to deny our parole. So the people in the real world, the people of public opinion, can really see how diabolical these beasts are. You know what I'm saying? And how they done that. And how people who have died in these prisons from cancer and other things that actually would have been found paroled or even had their convictions overturned with some of these changes with these laws, And if we start filing those type of massive lawsuits against the prison administration about that, we can get changes going, and I think that's what really need to be done. I've talked to Jill Lobo in the Asher case. Like I said, I'm a member of that. And I talked to a few other attorneys, and I'll be telling them, I say, we know historically there's cases on the books that's been ruled upon by the United States Supreme Court, the Ninth Circuit, the District Court, all the way down to the state level, that says when information is obtained through an informant, it has been compromised. It's no longer can be used to get a conviction. But yet you got prison officials come with that some evidence that would use it at a lower level to where you can't even get it in the court because they say, well, it meet that criteria of being able to be used. Yet you can say, wait a minute, okay, you allow this to be used. Let me kind of point this out. Here it is. You got a 1030 form to say, well, Mr. Red, you're a jailhouse lawyer. You have been passing legal stuff within the SHU to other members. And a confidential informant say that you was passing gang activities. I said, okay. Now, in order for me to pass my material to another prison, I have to go through you guys. You guys scrutinize everything, you look at it, and you sign off on it, and you pass it on. Where was the write-up then? Where did you identify? Well, we don't need to explain this to you, you know? So then, you know, and that's what they do, because they become arrogant where you catch them and then they don't need to explain that to you. But at the same time, we don't want to continue to be suffering in these solitary confinements, in these holes, all that. So then they say, well, why did you guys do a hunger strike? Well, if you look at, I got 7 C files. 6 of them is all 602s where I have complained about conditions. You either threw them in the trash can in my face, threw them in the trash can behind my back, and you just disregarded it or you rubber stamped them. So you left people no choice but to come up with a remedy that can get some changes. You sit up here, these books, George Jackson, and all these books is taught in universities. Yet, when we possess the books, it's gang activity. You know, I remember one time I received a Black Panther paper. IGI in Pelican Bay seized it. Said, Mr. Riggs, you're not allowed to have this because the Black Panther was a street gang. I say, are you serious? Say, yeah. And then they went to the next thing. Well, Hugo Purnell wrote an article in this paper, so you can't have this paper because he got an article in there and he's a validated member. I say, okay. I say, I done got the San Francisco Chronicle, I done got the Oakland Tribune, I got all the, and they got articles in by a lot of people. You never seized them. You know? So again, we have all the documentation that we can show that the system is corrupt, it's racist, and it's been abused. And that's what we need to do, is put them on court by the people on the outside, not the politicians, but by the people, and put them on trial. Let the people decide whether or not they have abused their whole little system. You know, how are you gonna sit up and have board members to judge your fate who are former wardens, who are ex-police, district attorneys, all these same people to determine whether or not you should be found suitable for parole? And then they got a rule, a regulation in the Title 15 that say you're entitled to a fair and impartial panel. So the question is, what constitutes a fair and impartial panel? They tell you, we don't need to answer that. Why you don't? You have a board member right here who, a commissioner, when Pete Wilson was running for governor, this father, who was a San Diego police, son was killed by a guy that was a San Quentin death row. So he helped campaign law enforcement to support Pete Wilson. In exchange for his services, Pete Wilson made him a board commissioner. Now he's sitting on my board, and they say, is there any reason anybody on this panel should be? I said, yeah, well, Mr. Baker right there should be on my panel. I don't personally know him, but because of the situation that had happened to his son, he already had said publicly to the newspaper, anybody convicted of murder would not be found suitable for parole. Now you can't take that away. He said that to the world, but yet now he's sitting on the parole board. So again, I think we need to, you know, put that think tank back together and come back to it. I love me a book, you know what I'm saying, a jailhouse lawyer, you know what I'm saying? And we need to go back to that think tank and start putting these new strategies together that goes outside of that political circle, you know? And we have a lot of young people out here now that got fire in them, that's fighting for change, you know, and they trying to make changes. So I think we need to unite with them and get that unity back out there and make these changes. That's my opinion right there.
Again, I wish you were with us because there's a lot of going on in the room here. Okay?
Well, I've always said, you know, prior to the pandemic, when Robin and I used to do a lot of traveling, you know, I've always said America is the greatest hypocrisy, not the greatest democracy.
Right, there you go.
And the reason it has lasted as an imperialist power for so long is because of that.
Right.
Adaptation, you know, you know, it is like you said, just, you know, I mean, we both, particularly me, did a lot of time in prison. So we know from experience the hypocrisy of prison administration and security and stuff. Like you say, they allow you to have something. And most of the court has said, you know, you got to let them have it as a First Amendment, you know. And then they turn around. I mean, I had that same problem you saying with COINTELPRO, you know.
Right.
Somebody sent me COINTELPRO and they wouldn't let me have it. So I was starting a legal process, challenge it in court. It's called an ARP, Administrative Remedy Procedure. You know, the legislature passed that to slow down the process because so many people were filing 1983 civil rights action against conditions and violation of the constitutional rights and stuff. And the guy right now who's in charge of, who founded one of the best prison run rehabilitation for Norris Henderson, he was also a clerk in the library, you know, and he came to me and said, look, you know, the grapevine said you're getting ready to drag these people in court for COINTELPRO. And I said, yeah, you know, I'm in Centala. That book according to many Supreme Court rulings, you know. I said, well, look, I got the book in the library. They don't even know. We got so much stuff because the prison library is being stocked by universities and high schools and all that there. So they wasn't aware. He said, you know, if you go through this, they're going to come in the library and do an inventory, you know, and they're going to discover all this Black literature and historical literature that's in the library, you know. He said, now I know how you are, you know, everybody knows you drag these people in the court and, you know, you put up a good fight. He said, but if you will agree to you know, draft this issue, I will personally give you COINTELPRO, and I will also give you a list of all the Black literature we have that these people have no knowledge whatsoever, you know. And so that's what eventually happened, you know. He brought me a copy of COINTELPRO and a list, and I was astounded by the Black literature that was in the prison library. And I knew, yeah, if they knew about this, it was gone, you know. And so it, you know, it was a balance between my desire for human rights against the harm that it could have done to the entire prison system. Yeah. So I know what you mean, you know, like I said, America is the greatest. I mean, you can see what's going on right now.
Exactly.
Back with January 6th insurrection, you know, these people are actually passing laws and whatever to say, well, that wasn't an insurrection, you know, that was, you know, if various organizations, particularly Black Lives Matter or Antifa or somebody would have went there, they'd still be carrying dead bodies.
Exactly.
Yeah, out of D.C., you know, but because they were right-wing extremists, you know, well, it wasn't a riot. It was people exercising their constitutional rights. So, I mean, this country, like I said, is the greatest hypocrisy, not the great, but they have developed a format in which allows them to stay in power.
I mean, and there's insult to injury because you still have certain politicians who's passing legislation for reparation for different races. But when it comes to the Africans,
it's a problem.
Exactly. It's a problem and there's no reparation. And if it is, then it's only on paper and nothing substantial that actually a reality, you know?
Yeah.
So again, I mean, it's time for us to, like I say, Oklahoma is a biggest one that we should use that Biden them signed where they started giving people in Oklahoma the reparation.
Yeah.
It took that long. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So, you know, there's problems and we need to expose, we need to use that social media. We need to exercise, educate these students in these schools, these colleges, and man, let's do this.
Got to raise that level of consciousness, you know.
Exactly.
Yeah, I like that.
And they smart. Them youngsters are smart now.
Turning everything around, actually, right? I mean, what you're proposing is to kind of actually the whole way we approached it about, you know, what's the role for the academy or something. It's actually the other way around, which is what you're showing us.
Right.
Now,
I mean, you know, when I first came out, you know, I had people getting at me saying, "Hey, we finna do this protest. We're gonna block the San Francisco Bridge and all this here." I say, well, why block the bridge? Because first of all, when they bring the tow trucks up, the people who losing their jobs, they're gonna get their cars towed. Let's go on a black market shutdown where don't nobody spend their money in the economy. You know, you don't buy no gas, you don't spend no money in the stores and nothing like that. That's a big effect because now if no money is being made, people gonna start listening. Politicians gonna start listening. And I used to say that in prison when we was talking about hunger strikes. I used to say, let's stop going to the canteen. Let's stop spending money in the canteen. The prices will go down. Things will change. You know? So it's time for us to make those great sacrifices, and people on the outside need to know we behind them as well.
Right. Thank you. All right, so we started a little bit late because we were having some technical issues, so I hope you'll bear with us just for a few more minutes. I think what we should try and do is have Daryl and then Joy James give us some kind of closing remarks. Maybe, Daryl, you could address some of these issues about the Academy since you've been, in part, you were a fellow at the Columbia at the Justice and Education program, so you're really close to that. And then maybe, Joy James, you could give us some final concluding thoughts about how we can do this properly, which is something that we all look to you for guidance. Daryl?
And let me grab my poetry book real quick.
Yeah, get your poetry ready, Paul, because that's where we're going to end, okay? Thanks.
So I'm just naturally interested in academic research, but in my experience with dealing with, I don't want to use the word inmates, but with dealing with my homies, who are curious about reading Black Panther movement, resistance, they want to know about this stuff. In a perfect example, a guy was interested in the title of Making a Second Ghetto. He was interested in that title. Like, yo, this looks dope, bro. They talking about making projects. Like, yeah, making housing projects. But when he tried to read it, like, bro, this stuff is boring. It's too much. So I think in that aspect, like there's a disconnect between the academy and my homies. And when I decided that I wanted to become a writer and I wanted to get into academia, my goal isn't to write for my colleagues in academia. And I know, like you said, you're like required to do that, like you have to, but that was never my goal. Like I want to write to my homeboys because I've seen an interest in this stuff, and when they pick up to try to read some of my books that are academically researched, it's too. Not saying that they can't learn it, but it's too boring. They don't want to like really sit down and go through it. They'd rather read something much more straightforward. But I do know, I will say this off the top of my head, Dr. Keisha Blaine, Dr. Ashley Farmer, they are doing really good work as far as doing academic research and making it more relatable, like to my homeboys. So that's what I see as far as academia and getting work out to people who aren't naturally interested in academia.
Thanks. Thanks, Daryl. All right, so we'll have the last intervention before Paul ends our session with some of his own writings and poetry. Joy James.
Yeah, it's great to close with art. So thanks, Paul. I noticed in the chat that there's a debate, which obviously we can't settle here, if all the incarcerated are political prisoners. I would just ask us to think about political agency, right? That suffering itself is not the equivalent of leadership. And Dharuba bin Wahad have said this before, that victimization does not automatically lead to leadership. But we know from this panel over the last 2 hours that people who've been held captive, who've been tortured, exerted political theory, imagination, and agency. And that's, as we look at everything, right? Climate devastation, the well-being of children, taking care of elders, medical care. I mean, there's a lot to look, it's a 360 spin. It's the agency that's risk-taking, and I'm going to go back to agape, and that's shaped by political will that allows you to love people you don't even like, because the concept of freedom has to emerge out of a democracy built on genocide, enslavement, and rape. And so with that kind of love and with a specific kind of leadership, which is always mutating, I do think that we can forge strategies, but it's not going to look like the mundane or the everyday or even the most privileged, who's always, I appreciate the dialectic coming in here. If there's a dialectical vanguard, then we have to create it. And there's going to be some degree of humility that will have to come from those of us who, like myself, who are more structured to be authoritative without having the experiential knowledge, right? That I wouldn't even want to have, right? Coming from Terror Zone. But I so appreciate people who have survived. And George had 99 books in his cell when he was assassinated. And Freedom Archives has this whole platform of the 99 books. So we're all intellectuals, but how we share that collective power to move on an imperial racist democracy that's moving on us, I think that's going to be the critical issue.
Thank you for that powerful guidance for all of us to keep our eyes on that and stay focused on that. So, Paul, we're going to close with a reading from you. Before we do, because I know that I think it's actually going to be, I think it's going to be our last word. I want it to be the closing, and I don't want to then thank everyone. So first, I want to thank you all for being on this panel. Albert Woodfox, Paul Redd, Joy James, and of course, Daryl Robertson for being here live too. And to all of you for being here and joining us. I also want to invite you to our next panel, which is going to be called Becoming Numerous Legacies of Queer and Trans Rebellion. We'll have Che Gossett and Jack Halberstam with us. We'll be reading The Stonewall Reader, Why We Fight, and other great books, including Jack's book Trance, A Quick and Quirky Account of Gender Variability, Che Gotzit's work on Kiyoshi Kuromiya, and other work. So join us on March 2nd, where we'll be looking at queer and trans rebellion. Paul, maybe you can...
Well, I want to read two things. One is
great.
my poem, and the other one I want to finish with Yaki and Joyce's book. It's something he talked about in regards to gangs, and I think it's very important what he's saying, that this is where we need to change the way we think and see things. So first of all, my poem is, what do you see? Decaying society torn apart, riddled in bullets and drugs, death, self-destruction, broken families, prisons within walls, without walls and bars. What do you see? Courtrooms full of angry youth, both men and women, victims of a decaying society. What do you see? Ourselves thrown into California prisons to be warehoused, never confronting the real problem, how we allowed ourselves to be exploited and manipulated. Yes, we see what you see yourself. Yes, we are from you. We call upon our community to take a stand. Organize, join forces with outside entities. Demand that we as prisoners be provided with the proper and correct tools to uplift us culturally, historically, educationally, to eradicate this eternal illness we have taken on. What do you see? Then let us change it together from within. And Brother Aki, when I was reading this book about Let's the Gang Up Together, I kind of liked what he said in here. And I wanted to end that with this. We need to do one of two things with regards to the word gang. One, abandon the word to those who have defined it. So now that it has a pretty negative connotation. Two, redefine the word. Create a new word or phrase to describe organized youth and groups in oppressed communities. However, new concepts must be developed to accomplish whichever choice we make. New forms of activity should begin to appear on the basis of a new concept. The people in the community must begin to work collectively to transform gangs into progressive organizations of African people which struggle for freedom and development. And thank you for the book.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for coming out. Thank you to the team at the People's Forum, Katie and everyone. And thank you, Fonda Shen, Director of the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought, for bringing us all together. See you on March 2nd. Take care and thanks.
All right. And I enjoyed talking to all you guys. Have a blessed one.
Thank you.
All right,
Thank
my
you.
bro.
Thanks, Paul.
All
Thanks,
right.
Albert.
Okay, well,
Bye-bye. Take care, Joy. Thank you
bye.
so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
We'll continue the conversation. We will.